I would like to say that things have changed over time, but I was born with HIV and I've been dealing with the same ideologies since I can remember. Black people have spent so much time, so many centuries being second-class citizens or not even being considered as human beings in the United States. There's so much systemic oppression still to this day that the thing that's at the forefront of most people in the black community is just surviving. We haven't even gotten out of the mode of survival yet into just living. And unfortunately, that often causes us to assimilate. So when you're trying to assimilate into society and to just be seen as a person, anything that makes you feel othered isn't welcome. So we don't have time to talk about gay rights. We don't have time to talk about HIV. If you get HIV, that's your life decision. I'm trying to be seen as a human being. I'm trying to be successful. I'm trying to take care of my family. When we don't have to worry about whether or not a traffic stop is going to be our death sentence, then maybe we can start talking about what it means to be black and queer, what it means to be a black woman and maybe living with HIV. I can probably count on one hand how many black trans men I know who are open about their HIV status. So there's this interesting phenomena that happens within the black trans male community. Oftentimes, the ones of us who are either bisexual or queer or fluid in our sexuality don't want to admit it. It's just as bad as down low gay men. And they don't want to admit it because there's this stigma about transitioning and then sleeping with a man. Because there's this misunderstanding about the difference between sex and gender. If you don't have facial hair, if you aren't masculine and play sports and have a girlfriend or get married and have a wife, then you're still not a man. But that's because that's what society tells us. I recently had a conversation with one of my brothers who I know is living with HIV, about how they haven't been on medication for years. And it broke my heart because I know that the medications are life-saving. But he is so terrified to go to a pharmacy and pick up his medicine because somebody might then know that he also likes to sleep with men. And so if you don't even want to have the conversation about your sexuality, you're definitely not going to have the conversation about your risk for HIV. My mother found out she was HIV positive when she was pregnant with me, and that's how my father found out that he was HIV positive. We don't know where he contracted HIV from, so that's still a mystery. But because of our status, the doctors gave me 3 years to live, and so my mother quit her job and she stayed at home with me for the first 3 years of her life. In my first year, my father died from AIDS complications. And I think initially it was her idea just to be at home with me so that we could die together. And when she realized that I wasn't dying and she wasn't dying, we kind of re-entered the world. My family owns a mega church in Detroit, Michigan, and all my cousins went to school there. And so when I was 4, my mother went to enroll me into preschool so I could go to school with the rest of my family. And they told her that I couldn't go to school there because they weren't equipped to handle someone like me. Now, I'm my mother's only child, so it made her very honest with me. She never beat around the bush. She was very direct and forward with me, and she let me know that I couldn't go to school with my cousins because we have HIV. I didn't understand what that meant because I didn't really understand what HIV was. My mother explained HIV to me as a Pac-Man, and my blood cells were what Pac-Man was eating, and that if I took my medication, it was like freezing Pac-Man to keep myself alive. So to me, it was like a video game. It was the first time I realized that there is something different about you. But when I was 6 years old, my mother found this camp called Camp Heartland. And Camp Heartland was for kids infected with HIV and for their family members who were not. And so at 6 years old, I went to this place where I met all these other kids that were living with HIV. And I went there every summer because it was the only place I felt accepted, where I felt like people liked me and didn't care that I had HIV. So it became my safe haven. And at 7, I started doing public speaking. I started traveling with Camp Heartland, telling my life story to help raise funds for the camp, and I loved it. I was a living example of what not to be afraid of, and that empowered me. It empowered me so much that when Camp Heartland called me to be on the Oprah show, I said, of course. I was in the 6th grade when Oprah called. I just was so excited. It was someone I looked up to. It was for an organization that I wanted to help. So I went and I did the show. But one thing I didn't think about was that, yeah, maybe 7th graders don't and 8th graders don't watch Oprah, but their parents do. And this is when I learned that it often wasn't the kids that were cruel, but it was their parents that fed them the hate to be cruel. And so I went to school the next day. It was very clear when I got to lunchtime and I went to sit with the people I always sat with, and they all got up and left. And from that moment, it was, oh, you know, AIDS, AIDS. My mother, who always insisted I took my medication, wasn't taking HIV medication herself. And I didn't know that until she ended up in the hospital that same year with about 3 T-cells. What that Oprah incident made clear to me was that no one understood who I was or the pain that stigma created other than my mother. And my mother died 3 years later. And I watched her die a slow, painful death. I watched her die a slow, painful death. A death that I never want to have. And it scared me so much that I became in charge of my own medical care. I knew when I needed to go to the doctors. I knew when my refills needed to be made. But it didn't make it easier to tell my story. I have this age ribbon on my wrist and my mother's name and death year. I got this done at 17 in someone's basement. But it was my reminder that it was my job to live. But I stopped talking about HIV after my mother died. And I never individually told anyone ever again that I had HIV until I was in my freshman year of college. I used to have a head full of hair, and I was getting my hair braided, and the woman who was doing my hair, her roommate, looked at my wrist and said, "Was that a breast cancer ribbon?" And I said, "No, it's an AIDS ribbon." And she goes, "What, do you have AIDS or something?" And I took a deep breath. And it's almost like in a split second I had to ask myself, are you going to run from this forever, or are you going to stand and be who you are? And I said, no, but I do have HIV. And in that room was the first time I had a conversation that felt educational with just 2 people. And I felt less afraid. And from that moment, I went on to continue telling my story. On top of that, I was dealing with my own gender identity. I never was real feminine. never identified as a girl or as a woman, but never had language around that. Until someone in college introduced me to the word transgender, I realized that if I was going to live, which I was, that I was going to live fully. I got myself in therapy and I did all the things I needed to do to make sure I could transition. And that probably was the best decision I ever made for me, for myself in my life. Because once I was able to live in the world as I've always seen and known myself, nothing else mattered. I didn't shy away from my HIV. I didn't shy away from my gender identity. I was able to go on to start a business that was very successful. So here I am now in Atlanta, 33, living with HIV, a transgender pregnant man who not only is an advocate for our community, but is an advocate for living one's dreams. Because there's nothing in life that should stop us from reaching the visions that are in our head. And I know that as a Black person, I know that as someone living with HIV, and I know that as someone who is queer. But it's worth the fight.